But I really think we were coming into this problem with such great numbers. Everything was working right for us. And the big thing that you always have to remember, guys, we sell a product. And our product is in such demand because the supply is just not there. And if you go back, I did a whole webcast on Big Shifts Ahead, the book by Chris Porter and I can't remember John's last name. But that book will tell you what is going on in this country and what's going to go on through 2025. And our business will continue to be strong. We got this blip. We got this, all these rent strikes that people are talking about, but we'll survive it. It's not like because the reason is we've benefited from sound financial underwriting of our properties, as opposed to 2008, where it was just stupid. I love that movie, The Big Short. My most favorite scene is the stripper scene. You know what I mean? And Stephen Carell realizes the stripper's got 6 condos. It's just, that doesn't make any sense.
That was after I watched the movie, I was talking to a friend of mine, and I referenced that scene all the time when he's like, "Oh, my other place," and he's like, "How many places do you own?" 7 different condos. It's like,
exactly.
Okay. But no, yeah. I happen to agree. I think the economic fundamentals heading into this were different than the past. I was younger in the past. That's the truth. But when you watch a movie like The Big Short and you read about the stuff that was going on, you have to feel good that as Chris mentioned, we have no idea where this is going to shake out. But economically and fundamentally, and just population growth and demographics, and that book is another great book. You got to feel good about the fundamentals, especially in the housing sector. So you feel a little bit better about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you expand a little bit on, I haven't read the book. I'm sure there's plenty of people listening that haven't read the book. Can you take a couple minutes and expand on what you mean by, the big shifts ahead and why we're in such a good position? Like, what is your takeaway from what they said and your spin on it, basically?
All right. John Burns, I just remember his last name, and Chris Porter. Burns owns the consulting firm that basically does economic statistics for real estate. That's his primary focus. And he and Chris Porter wrote this book called Big Shifts Ahead. And they had me at hello pretty much when he was explaining how he's not going to use the old terminology of baby boomers and millennials and Gen X and Gen Y, because that is nothing more than a descriptor for birth rates, and it doesn't describe real generations. And so instead, he took everybody from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, all the way up to 2000, and everybody got a 10-year, decade-long window. That was it. So I was born in the 60s, and we're called the equalers, and that's the generation that the women started to become more equal, and men started to stay home at more, and women's incomes went up, and that's what happened during my generation. Then he tells a story that, like my generation, people born in the 60s, they have the lowest amount of equity than any other generation at this time, because we got our asses kicked. When we got out of college, we went right into a recession. Then in 2000, the .com blow up, and then the Big Short blow up. We got killed when our peak earning years were all happening at those times when we were losing our shirts. And so that's why my generation is the they call it equal, also has the lowest amount of equity. Now, the way he explained it that I totally got was the baby boomers, by definition, are anyone born from 1946 to 1964. I was born in 1964. I have zero in common with somebody born in 1946. That guy's looking at, he's picking out caskets, and I'm still trying to get kids through college. So I have nothing in common with that guy. And so they broke down the generations. And then they lay on top of it, obviously their focus is on housing, but they talked about, the generation, the millennials right now, are the people, I can't remember what he calls people born in 2000, but they anticipate that 72% of that generation will never own homes. Mm-hmm. Will never own homes. They're just going to be renters. And that's okay. It's not, we always thought, like when I got out of college, hey, I have to buy a home because that's what everybody does. They don't have that attitude. Mm-hmm. They have a totally different mindset. And we, as producers of a product that they buy, we have to understand their mindset and give them what they need. So that's how, I mean, I did I think you can go on my website and find the link to it. But that's was a great book. And man, that's what made me realize I got to build. I mean, I can't just sit around and wait for deals to crop up. The demand will always be high. You know, I used to, before I used to say things like, the best markets are the ones that are picking up congressional seats, because that way you can tell where the people are migrating to. The North is losing congressional seats. The South is picking up congressional seats. So the growth is in the South. In actuality, and this is what they talked about in the book, all markets are growing. All markets, even if they're losing congressional seats, they're just not growing as fast as these other places. Mm-hmm. And they really break it down into where the growth is. I know, well, I mean, Chris, when you and I were talking last time, and I saw your portfolio and where you were. I mean, you're Ohio, but down there in Jacksonville, man, that's just, forget about it. That place is just going to continue to take off. So, and it's all spelled out in this book. It's a fantastic, and this book was written 5 years ago. Yeah. And, it was, I'd love to talk to the guys and find out what did they do right? What did they do wrong? And so far, by my reading of it, they've nailed it. They absolutely nailed it.
I would say the best part, what I liked about the book, and it's actually sitting in our office on Anthony's desk, Chris. So if you want to read it, it's there.
Chris, there are nice pictures. You can, if you
it is. It's got good graphs.
You went to Hofstra.
I'll just take the pictures. That's it then.
So, yeah.
But what they do really good is they break it down. That 10-year window, because they make a lot of references early on to millennials and Gen X, and they there's 20-year gaps, right?
Yeah.
I'm a millennial, but I have nothing in common with the younger side of the demographic. Right. So they take it one step further, and I like that. And when I first read it, I said, it's just their way to sell some books by like recoding all the names, right? Just being a little different. But there was a lot more that went into it, and I think that's the piece of the puzzle for the multifamily and housing in general that is pretty exciting. And they do a really good job just even talking about like interests and like, this group, has more interest on Facebook, and this group is more, they do a really good job of just really breaking down, the mindset of each 10-year gap. So I think it's anyone in the multifamily space or housing space, you should read the book. I mean, it's just fundamental for housing.
And another thing that they talked about that was a real eye opener was immigrants. And the importance of immigrants to our society, and that we cannot continue to grow with just our current population base. We have to bring in immigrants, or everything will implode. That's the only way we're going to survive. So very cool.
Yes, I think it's interesting. I think one thing I thought of was whenever somebody's defined like millennials or Gen Z, because I'm towards the quote unquote younger end of millennials, like I'm the tail end of it. I don't relate at all with the older end of it. I mean, I do now because I'm older and I'm more of an adult than I was a few years ago. But 3, 4, 5 years ago, didn't relate to the eldest millennials because they were mid 30s, give or take, and I couldn't relate. And it's interesting because for me, I relate to like both sides a few years, but I also know that there's so many people even within the classification that are very different. Like I have several friends that are looking to buy homes, that want to own homes and stay here. And I have so many friends that are looking to move away to more affordable places. So I think it's got to be a really good balancing act of, where do we stop the classification? Like how granular do we get? Because then at some point you're just getting too in the weeds. And I think it's an overload of information and you can't even take it in. So I do think it's interesting to hear them break it down into 10-year gaps because it probably is more relatable, but I have a tough enough time of keeping track of 3, 4, 5 classifications of people. Now, if you're telling me I've got to keep track of the names for 10 classifications of people, I don't know if I personally can keep track of that, but maybe everybody else can.
There are about 3 classifications that we as apartment owners need to focus on. It's really the last 3, the most recent 3. But you talk about getting granular. Just think about this. When he described this, it threw me for a loop. and I believe if I say this wrong, I might be off in the decades, but you'll get the concept. The people that were born at the early end of the 80s, they are doing much better than the people in the same decade who were born at the end of the decade. Because the people who were born at the beginning purchased homes in the early 2000s. Before the crash, they built up equity. The people who were born in the end of the 80s bought homes right when it crashed. They lost their shirt. And these are people all within the same decade. So you talk about granularity. Well, boy, yeah, there's an example of people within the same decade who have big shifts between them. But, one of the other ones is, you talk about having friends who are buying houses, having friends who are looking to move home. One thing that they talked about that was really interesting is the people who were born in the 50s couldn't wait to get out of their houses. They got out of their parents' home. They never wanted to live with their parents. They got married earlier than other generations. Their children are staying home and living at home, and they want them to. The parents love it when their kids come back. I tell you, all my kids came back because of COVID, but hey, it's great having them around. I love having them around. I wonder when this whole thing is going to end, but the U-Haul truck just got back from Harlem last week. They all moved out of New York City, so I don't know when they're going back. So
that's the other thing too I was thinking about is, and I was happy you answered when the book was written 5 years ago. Obviously, no one saw this happening, and this is something that we had talked about a little bit previously, and John and I have spoken about with numerous people in between ourselves, is how does this new wave of awareness on diseases and close proximity affect future desires in housing and, living space and things of that nature? Because tons of people, anybody that basically could afford to leave New York City flocked away. It's shown in mail forwarding, in tracking cell data, and just, common sense and seeing what's happened. The most populated, the higher income areas within New York City and the surrounding boroughs, they're desolate. There's nobody there. So we have all this data that basically everybody that could afford to leave, didn't have to stay because of work or family or cost, got the hell out of there. So what does that say for when things open back up? Are people going to take a long, hard look at, closer proximity, higher density areas and find them less desirable? Or is this going to be like a lot of other things? We have super short-term memories. We're going to go back to loving what we love, and we're just going to move forward and move on. So I think that's one of the things too that could see a change in what we were talking about of home ownership versus renting, of maybe now there's a greater importance of having the backyard, having the extra space, being able to get away, being able to work from home. And people now are going to place a greater emphasis on purchasing that home instead of renting it versus, most people are just going to rent an apartment, I think, than buy a condo, at least in my opinion. I could be totally wrong. But when I hear just within my own sphere of knowing people, I hear very few people talk about buying a condo versus renting an apartment in New York City. But when they talk about living out on Long Island or in Westchester or in Jersey or Connecticut, significantly more people are looking to buy a home instead of rent a home. So I wonder if that shift is going to change too, where we were definitely trending towards more renters nationwide. And now do we see more of a shift towards people valuing the ability to actually own a home and have more space? So that's something that's been playing in my mind a lot recently. And curious to hear what you think.
I think the answer is, like we're talking about, it's generational. When you're talking about, what's going to happen after this COVID thing? Are we going to go back to the same old, same old? I think the older generations are looking to go back to the same old, same old. I think the younger generations are saying, hey, we just got a glimpse of a different way of life. And that looked pretty good. I know that my daughter's boyfriend, he works for a Fortune 500 company out in San Francisco, and he's working remotely. And he's just been notified that they will continue to work remotely through January 1st. And even then, they may not come back to an office. They may do everything remotely after that point. And everyone's okay with that.
Yeah.
My next door neighbor, he says that their productivity is higher now because of it. And that part of it is changing. So I think the younger generations of people that use computers all day long and can take their laptop anywhere. This could change everything for them. The older generation, hey, I want to go down to the country club. I want to sit with my buddies at the bar. I want to go, hit the golf ball and not have to worry about, touching the pin, for crying out loud. Gosh. And so that's, I think it's going to be a generational answer.
I also think the other thing that the other underlying factor there, as I agree 100%, because my dad, even his office told him, work remotely for, perpetuity, right? Forget about it. Like, don't they closed their New York City office. They're based out of Jersey, and he's a lawyer, and they sue a lot of people. So they need a New York address. So they said, you live in Long Island, go get a little office space in Long Island. And now he doesn't have to do a 2.5 hour commute every day. But the other thing in that bucket, you still got to remember the affordability to buy a house. You may not want to live in an apartment complex. And maybe super urban areas. New York is New York. It'll always be New York. I think it's going to get punched in the teeth, and it might come down a little bit. I do think opportunities in New York will start showing themselves again. But the younger demographic, they just can't afford to buy the houses that they want. Housing prices in Long Island, Connecticut, not parts of Jersey, you can't just go out and buy a house, even if you really want one, unless you want to go really far out on Long Island, or you're gonna have to sacrifice neighborhood. And I don't think the younger demographic is gonna sacrifice neighborhood to afford a house where they can get a really nice apartment. Now, maybe the apartments have to change, but the affordability of buying a house is still super expensive, and that's still what I think is going to be a major barrier to people not wanting to live in an apartment because of this. I still think they're going to have to. Do I think I want to build Class A luxury high rise? No, but I still think that B and C space is just they can't just go out and buy a house tomorrow. It's very difficult for them. Not only because mortgage restrictions are harder, but the earned income, they just might not have it. So I think that's another major barrier that will keep the apartment world strong.
And the deductibility of the mortgage interest is gone. I mean, they talked about that in the book. And, why own? I mean, that was such a great reason for, and that was why I bought my first place is, to have the tax deductibility of it. But other than that, it's gone. But let's talk for a moment about something you mentioned, and that's the A's and the B's and the C class properties. The problem that all of these countries up here in New Hampshire and in Massachusetts. Let me talk just about New Hampshire because I've read the law from start to finish. In New Hampshire, the building of apartments tends to be entirely Class A, luxury. Mm-hmm. And obviously because of the cap rates and the rents that you can get, that's why. You can afford to build in those communities if you're getting that type of return. Marcus Millichap, I went to one of the regional conferences in Boston a couple months ago, and they talked about the difference in occupancy rates between A and C over the next 5 years. And they called C something different at the time. It was novel to me. Something different than what we call C. For them, C-class property is new construction, but workforce housing. C is workforce housing. I look at C-class properties, 1970s construction, flat roof, single pane windows, chiller boiler systems. That's a C-class property. In the new world, C-class are workforce housing with no amenities. Now, the only way you can build those types of places in all those communities that you just talked about, and especially up here in New Hampshire, is you've got to get the communities on board to reduce the density requirements, to change the zoning requirements, to allow you to do certain things. You'll put a couple of units into workforce housing rates, but I can't, like I just looked at a 26 acre parcel of land that we're probably gonna develop. Right now, by right, I can do 72 units. Well, 72 units is cutting it close for me. I got to get 100 units on that property. and they want these units because they know the demand, that people aren't living there, but people can't buy in their community. They're going to have to lay off teachers. They want to get more people into their community. So they're going to have to work with me in order for me to walk in and buy that land and start to develop it. And so, you can start taking advantage of those changes in the law in order to successfully and financially successfully build C-class properties.
Yep. Did you say 26 acres?
Yeah.
72 units?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's 3 units an acre. That's the craziest lowest density I think I've ever heard of.
7,500. Well, I got wetlands on the property too. So
Gotcha.
Not all buildable. So it's 7,500 square feet per unit is what they allow by right. So that's what they were coming up with.
Gotcha.
And these are the fun things that you when you go from the owning operating side to over to the developing side. These are the new things that you get to learn, and it's I love it, man. It's you're doing something different. You're creating something that didn't exist until you came along. That's how you create value. On the multifamily side, the performing side, the way you create value is you increase the rents, you cut the expenses. That's how you create value.